Mr. Browder.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. The story that I'm going to share with you today will leave you in no doubt that Russia doesn't function as a normal state as we know it. It functions more akin to a criminal enterprise. The story that I want to tell you is about Sergei Magnitsky, who was my lawyer, who died in horrific circumstances in Russian state custody 2.5 years ago. And it is my duty to his memory and to his family to make sure that justice gets done in this case and that this story gets told widely across the world. The story starts out 15 years ago. I moved to Russia and set up an investment fund called Hermitage Capital Management, which eventually grew to become the largest investment fund in the country. In the process of investing, I learned that all the companies I was investing in were losing money through massive corruption. And I decided to fight the corruption by exposing it through the international media. As you might imagine, this created a number of enemies, and as you mentioned in my introduction, I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security, and that's when the real trouble began. In 2007, my offices were raided by 25 police officers from the Interior Ministry of Moscow, which is the police department. They took away all of our corporate documents, and those corporate documents were then used to expropriate our companies. And then through a very complicated scheme, they then used those corporate documents to steal, not from us, but from the Russian state, $230 million of taxes that we paid in the previous year. I went out and hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky, who worked for an American law firm called Firestone Duncan to investigate. And Sergei went out, investigated, and found documentary evidence proving high-level official involvement in the theft of the $230 million. Instead of turning a blind eye, as many others in Russia would have done, he decided to testify against the officers, and he testified against them in October of 2008. And 1 month after his testimony, he was arrested by the same people he had testified against, put in pretrial detention in Russia, and then tortured to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day in order to sleep deprive him. They put him in cells with no heat, no window panes in December in Moscow, and he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. After 6 months of this, he became ill. He lost 40 pounds. He developed pancreatitis and gallstones, and he was prescribed to have an operation on the 1st of August 2009. 1 week before the operation, his jailers came to him with a Faustian bargain. They said, if you sign the following confession saying you stole the $230 million and you testify against Bill Browder, me, that you can then have the medical attention you need. In spite of the unbearable physical pain, Sergei refused to sacrifice his integrity and didn't sign the paper. And as a result, they abruptly moved him to a prison called Butyrka, which is known around Russia as being one of the toughest and most unpleasant prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, Butyrka had no medical facilities whatsoever. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain. He wrote 20 different requests in writing for medical attention. All of them were rejected by the authorities. And on the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. Only then did they move him to a prison that had an emergency room. But instead of treating him, they put him in an isolation cell, chained him to a bed, and allowed 8 riot guards with rubber batons to beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died. He was 37 years old. How do we know all this? We know it because Sergei did something very unusual. He documented it all in 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention. And as a result of that, we have the most well-documented human rights abuse and extrajudicial killing case in the history of Russia. Now, this is a tragic case and a heartbreaking case for me and his family and for anyone around him. But the reason why this is politically significant is not what they did to him. This happens all the time. It's the cover-up that the government embarked on afterwards. The Russian government, on the day he died, said he died of natural causes. They weren't aware that he was ill. They've since exonerated all of the police officers, Interior Ministry officials, prosecutors, and judges from any liability. Some of them have been promoted, some of them have been given state honors. To add insult to injury, instead of prosecuting anyone who did this to him, They're now prosecuting Sergei himself. 2.5 years after his death, they're now prosecuting Sergei Magnitsky for the trumped-up crimes they arrested him for in the first ever posthumous prosecution in Russian history. Not even Stalin did that. It's clear that there's no possibility of justice in Russia for Sergei's case or many, many other cases like it. And as a result, I've sought justice outside of Russia, and in 11 parliaments around the world that are now considering visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, as well as other gross human rights abusers. And most significantly, this Congress is also considering the same thing. I would argue that in the absence of any possibility of justice in these cases, that something needs to be done, and that's the thing that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for that powerful testimony. Mr.